Grieving widower sheltered a pregnant Navajo woman and her child, unaware she was being tracked by ruthless outlaws. The wind howled through the canyon like a warning. Thick clouds crawled over the Arizona sky, heavy with dust and secrets. Somewhere along the jagged path that twisted through the desert rocks, a man moved slowly, his boots worn from years of chasing shadows. His name was Thomas Granger, a widower who had buried his wife 2 winters ago, and since then had spoken more to his horses than to people. The grief had made him quiet, made his eyes hollow and his hands slower. But it hadn't broken him completely. Not yet. Thomas lived alone on the edge of a dry ravine, in a modest wooden cabin surrounded by mesquite trees and silence. His ranch, once full of cattle and life, was now a place of survival. He kept just enough to live on. No visitors came by unless they were lost or desperate. That's why, when he saw the figure limping down the distant trail that evening, holding the hand of a small child and cradling her swollen belly with the other, something inside him stirred. A warning, maybe, or curiosity, or perhaps the faint, painful echo of purpose. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her dark hair was matted with dust, and her dress clung to her like old paper, thin and torn. The child with her was maybe 5, small and quiet, staring up at Thomas with wide, wary eyes. Without speaking, he stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the tree line behind her, then nodded. They crossed his land like ghosts. That night, Thomas cooked beans and cornbread. She ate like a woman who had forgotten what a full belly felt like. She didn't say much, just that her name was Ayanna, and the girl was her daughter, Nita. No last name, no questions asked. Thomas didn't push. He had his own ghosts. If a person wanted to keep theirs silent, that was their right. But something didn't sit right with him. She flinched at every sound. She kept glancing toward the windows. And every now and then, when she thought no one was watching, she'd whisper things in Navajo under her breath, words soaked in fear. By the second day, it became clear that Ayanna wasn't just wandering. She was running, and not just from hardship, but from someone or something. Thomas noticed the bruises on her arms, faint but fresh. He saw the way her daughter clung to her, not like a child clings to a mother for comfort, but like she was protecting her. The girl was too quiet, too alert. Children that young weren't supposed to have eyes like that. Still, Thomas didn't ask. He gave them space. He fixed up the old barn so they could have privacy. He shared food, blankets, warmth. It wasn't pity. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was just the first thing in a long time that felt real. But as the days turned into a week, and the shadows around the ranch grew heavier, Thomas started keeping his rifle closer. He had lived long enough to know when a storm was coming. One afternoon, while chopping firewood near the edge of the property, Thomas saw something that made the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Boot tracks. Fresh. Deep. Too large to belong to Ayanna or her daughter. They led from the creek bed up the hill, toward the barn, then circled back into the brush. Someone had been watching. He didn't tell her. He just doubled his watch, kept the fire burning longer at night, and started walking the perimeter every dawn. That was when the questions began whispering in his mind. Why was she running? Why didn't she want to go to town? What had happened to the man who left her with child? And most of all, why did her fear feel bigger than just a bad relationship or a rough patch of luck? One evening, as the sun melted behind the rocks, Thomas stood on the porch sipping coffee, staring at the horizon. Ayanna sat a few feet away, humming a tune that didn't match her eyes. The child was drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Suddenly, Nita froze. Her hand trembled, and she looked toward the trees. Thomas followed her gaze but saw nothing. Still, he knew that look. A hunter's daughter. She knew when something was out there. That night, Thomas dreamed of fire. Of horses screaming and men shouting in a language he didn't know. When he woke, his shirt was damp, and he could hear coyotes howling too close to the barn. 2 days later, he found the first sign of real danger. A dead rabbit hanging from a branch, gutted but not eaten. Just left there. A warning. Navajo tradition spoke of signs like that. Witches, skinwalkers, or worse, men who wanted to stir fear in others. Ayanna didn't need to see it. She already knew. Her silence became heavier, her eyes more distant. She started sleeping with a knife under her blanket, and her daughter didn't speak at all anymore. It was Thomas who broke the silence. Sitting by the fire, he asked her if someone was hunting her. She looked up slowly, her lips parting slightly like she might speak. But instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. It was old, worn from travel. He opened it. A bounty notice. 2 names listed. hers, and her daughter's, wanted for murder. Thomas's heart skipped. The poster looked official but wrong. The sketch was crude. The charges vague. No sheriff's seal, just a stamp from a distant outpost he didn't recognize. And the reward, $2,000 dead or alive. Too high for poor fugitives. Too high unless someone powerful wanted them found. She whispered then, just 4 words. They killed my husband. She didn't say who. She didn't explain. But her voice cracked like drywood. And for the first time, Thomas saw not just fear, but rage in her eyes. He folded the paper and tossed it into the fire. The next morning, he found horse tracks again. 3 sets this time. Heavy fast, heading toward his land. He knew what it meant. The hunters were getting closer. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that one of the riders wasn't coming for Ayanna. One of them was coming for him. A ghost from his own past. Someone who had once buried secrets in the same soil Thomas now called home. The story he thought was hers was also his. And the outlaws didn't just want blood. They wanted silence. The wind had shifted. It came from the east now, bringing with it the faint scent of sweat, leather, and gun oil. Thomas knew that smell. It had haunted many camps in his younger years, back when he still wore a uniform and carried out orders he no longer believed in. He didn't tell Ayanna, but the moment he saw those 3 fresh sets of tracks, he started preparing for something he hadn't faced in over a decade, a siege. He quietly boarded up the cabin windows, reinforced the barn door, sharpened every blade, cleaned every rifle, and stacked supplies in the root cellar. At night, he taught Nita how to be invisible. He showed her how to move through shadow, how to recognize animal sounds that weren't animals at all. The girl didn't ask questions. She just listened, like she had been born ready for survival. Ayanna watched from the porch, her face unreadable, as if she was preparing herself for something darker than death. 3 nights later, Thomas heard the first shot. It wasn't meant to kill, just to test his nerves. A single crack, distant, near the tree line. He waited in silence, heart steady, breath slow. But nothing followed. The next morning, he found the remnants of a fire about a mile out, along with cigarette butts and spent shells. The men weren't just hunting, they were playing. He knew then this wasn't a bounty chase. This was something deeper, personal. Someone had given these men time and money to make sure she didn't just disappear, but suffered. Thomas had seen those kinds of men before. The kind who hid behind fake laws and bought silence with bullets. That same day, Thomas noticed something odd in his barn. A floorboard that had shifted, exposing something buried beneath. He pried it up and found an old, rusted box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to a name Thomas hadn't heard in years, Elias Mercer. The name hit him like a shovel to the gut. Elias had once owned this land before Thomas bought it cheap after the war. Rumors said Elias had gone missing, that he'd run off with Confederate gold or angered the wrong men. But these letters told a different story. They spoke of land deals gone bad, of a secret agreement with railroad men, of betrayal among friends. The last letter was the most chilling. Written in a desperate, frantic scrawl, Elias begged for help. Said someone was coming for him. A man with cold eyes and a broken batch. Said he buried something on the land, something they wanted back. Thomas folded the letter and stared at the barn floor. Now he understood. This wasn't just about Ayanna. This land held more than memories. Something had been hidden here, and someone believed Ayanna knew where it was. Maybe her late husband had stumbled onto it. Maybe she had witnessed something no one was supposed to see. Whatever the truth was, Thomas knew one thing. The men hunting them weren't going to stop. That night, he confronted her. No words, just the letter in his hand. Her eyes widened when she saw the name Elias Mercer. Her lips trembled, and for the first time, she told the full truth. Her husband, David, had been a mapmaker. A quiet man who worked for the reservation but also freelanced for settlers and miners. Months before his death, he'd been hired to survey old properties near Canyon del Muerto, including the very land Thomas now owned. He found something old markings, coordinates carved into stone. He believed they pointed to hidden gold, not from Confederate times, but from a failed Spanish expedition. Before he could tell anyone else, he was ambushed. Left for dead. Ayanna found him bleeding in the dirt. Before he died, he whispered one thing: trust no one with a badge. The men who killed him hadn't just wanted gold. They wanted silence. And now they thought Ayanna knew where it was. The bounty poster was fake. A cover. A trap. They weren't after justice. They were after treasure. Thomas felt the weight of every mistake he'd ever made settle on his shoulders. He'd seen too much death in his life. Too many lies wrapped in flags and badges. He wasn't going to let it happen again. Not here. Not this time. The next few days were spent in silence. Preparing. Planning. Thomas knew the hunters would make their moves soon. They had been circling too long. They were waiting for the right moment, or for Ayanna to run. But she wasn't running anymore. The storm hit at dusk. It started with fire. The barn was set alight. Flames tore through the drywood like paper, and Thomas barely got the horses out in time. As he staggered from the smoke, a bullet struck the dirt near his boots. Then another. Shadows moved along the ridge. 3 men. One of them tall, with a limp and a wide-brimmed hat. Thomas recognized him from long ago. Sheriff Cole Braxton. Not a lawman anymore, at least not in any real sense. The others were strangers, but he knew their type. Hard muscle. Dead eyes. They wanted Ayanna. They wanted the child. And they wanted Thomas out of the way. But Thomas didn't step aside. He fought with the fury of a man who had buried his soul once and refused to do it again. He moved through smoke and shadow, picking them off one by one. But he was older now. Slower. And they were cruel. One of them got close enough to throw a blade. It caught Thomas across the ribs. Another fired into the cabin, grazing Ayanna's arm. Nita screamed, and the sound shattered the night. It was the girl who saved them. As Braxton advanced, dragging Ayanna by the hair, Nita emerged from the shadows with a pistol Thomas had hidden under the floorboards. She didn't hesitate. She fired once. The shot rang out, too loud, too final. Braxton dropped. The other 2 scattered like rats. When the smoke cleared, Thomas lay bleeding on the porch, Ayanna kneeling beside him. He was alive, barely. But the real wound wasn't the knife. It was the truth. Before Braxton died, he said one thing. It was never about the gold. It was about what Elias knew. Thomas understood too late. There were still secrets buried beneath this land. Deeper than treasure. Darker than greed. Secrets someone still wanted hidden. And though Braxton was dead, the storm wasn't over. For 3 days, Thomas drifted in and out of fever. The knife wound had gone deep, slicing past ribs and muscle, but not far enough to kill. Ayanna packed the wound with herbs she'd learned from her grandmother. Nita barely left his side. At times, the wind outside the cabin whispered like voices from a different life. He saw his wife's face in dreams, sometimes smiling, sometimes turning away. He heard the echo of old orders shouted across fields soaked with blood. The past was trying to claim him, but he wasn't ready to go. When he finally sat up on his own, the world had changed. The barn was a skeleton of ash. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood. Ayanna stood at the window, holding her arm where the bullet had grazed her. She looked older now, not from age, but from the weight of everything she had carried. Thomas knew that weight well. He asked about Braxton's final words again. It was never about the gold. It was about what Elias knew. What Elias knew. Not what he found. Not what he hid. They went back to the barn together, digging through the place where Thomas had found the old letters. The floorboards creaked underfoot. Ayanna sifted through the ashes, then stopped. Beneath a scorched beam, there was a hollow pocket in the dirt. Inside, they found a second box, smaller than the first, wrapped in leather, sealed with wax. Inside wasn't gold. No maps. No coordinates. Just a set of documents. Names. Signatures. Ledgers. It was proof. Land transactions, forced removals, military raids. All signed off by people still alive, still in power. Men who had carved empires out of other people's bones. Elias Mercer hadn't found treasure. He had found corruption. Deals between army officers, railroad barons, and bounty hunters. They had traded land and blood like poker chips. Ayanna's reservation had been one of the targets. Her husband had stumbled onto the records when he surveyed the land. That's why he was killed. That's why she was hunted. Thomas stared at the papers. Some of the names he recognized. One of them had visited his ranch years ago wearing a colonel's badge. Another had ridden with him during the war. These weren't distant shadows. These were men he had once trusted. Ayanna wanted to take the records to the authorities. Thomas shook his head. These are the authorities, he said, his voice rough as gravel. They couldn't go to the law, but they couldn't keep running either. So Thomas came up with a plan. Over the next week, they faked their departure. Word was already spreading in town that an old man and an Indian woman had been attacked, that the barn had burned down, and that the attackers had vanished. Rumors said Thomas had died from his wounds. They let those rumors grow. Thomas rode into town only once, hidden under a wide hat and scarf, to send the documents to someone he trusted. An old reporter in Tucson who had once been jailed for printing stories too close to the truth. By the time the dust settled, the land was sold under a false name. Ayanna and Nita vanished into the desert with new papers. Thomas stayed behind just long enough to light one last fire, not to destroy, but to cleanse. He burned the last of the letters. The past didn't deserve to be preserved. 3 weeks later, in a remote canyon far from roads and rails, a small home stood under the red rocks. There, Ayanna gave birth to a son. Healthy, strong, named Elias, after the man who had tried to speak truth into a deaf world. Thomas arrived not long after, walking with a cane now, slower but still solid. He brought supplies, tools, seeds, a rifle. He didn't say much, but when he looked at the child, something in his eyes softened. For a time, peace held. But truth doesn't die quietly. One morning, a rider arrived at the canyon. He wore no badge, but his boots were polished, his coat pressed clean. He asked no questions, just sat by the fire and handed Thomas a folded newspaper. On the front page was an article, "Whistleblower Reveals Government Plot and Land Theft Scandal." The names were all there. The documents had been published. Some officials had resigned. One had vanished. The writer said nothing more, just nodded once and wrote on. Thomas knew what it meant. The truth was out, but that didn't mean they were safe. Truth was dangerous. It made enemies. That night, Thomas walked out into the desert alone. The wind was cold again, coming from the east. It carried the scent of coming storms. He stood beneath the stars, listening to the silence. He didn't believe in happy endings, but he believed in choices, and he had made his. Back at the canyon, Ayanna rocked her newborn in silence. Nita played by the creek, laughing for the first time in weeks. They weren't free, but they were no longer hunted. And for now, that was enough.